to the SSPX podcast. In this 7th episode in our Digital Dangers series, we continue to examine the negative impact screens and digital content have on adolescent development. As we've already touched on in earlier episodes, screens and the content they deliver adversely affect the mental and emotional maturation of young people, with some content, such as pornography, inflicting lifelong damage. These dangers are considered in more detail today, with special attention paid to the responsibilities that all parents must shoulder to ensure their children grow up mentally, emotionally, and above all, spiritually healthy. Included in this discussion are lessons for how adults, too, can take steps to protect themselves in our omnipresent digital age. Here is Father Jonathan Kopec to guide us in this 7th episode of Digital Dangers.
Hi, Father. Welcome back. We're on to the next episode of Digital Dangers. The last time we were talking about the effects and influence of pornography, and in this episode we're going to, on the one hand, zoom in. We're going to talk especially about the application of some of these discussions in particular to adolescents, so not exclusively for parents, but primarily for parents, though there are definitely things to be discussed that will be relevant to everyone. But in that sort of subsection, we're also, for a moment at least, zooming out from pornography to talk about the bigger picture of how the technology affects adolescents. So maybe to start, I think you want to talk about the effects of just general technology use on adolescents.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking we can kind of basically just go over almost everything we've talked about, really, and just apply it to children.
Perfect.
Anyone, I guess if we want to define adolescent, it could be more or less anyone who's still in a state of physical and emotional formation, like they're still growing.
Yeah.
But it's still, like you said, kind of applicable to all of us, because we can look back and maybe point to things in our own childhood. We're like, oh, maybe that's where that came from. But okay, well, really the main point is that every aspect that we've talked about so far, as far as the dangers of technological use, everything from, just the weakening of our mental abilities to all of the real moral issues, all of these are equally, first of all, dangerous to a child. But then because of their state as a child and because of their still being in a place of formation, physically, mentally, emotionally, it's much worse. All of the things are compacted, basically, is what it comes down to, because we're talking about a system that's still growing. So every negative effect is worsened. So if we were to harken back to what the kind of our first conversation, we're talking about neurological pathways and our neuroplasticity and how we grow in habits and things like that. The scholastic world of psychology would say that the mind of a child is born tabula rasa, so a blank slate. And that has absolutely perfect grounding in science as well, in the sense where, the moment of a brain's, even starting with conception, because you're already going to start with, growing neurons pretty quickly, but all throughout our formation, but especially at the very beginning, the earlier back you go, the more formable that person's brain is, that person's nervous system and everything. So the habits are we're talking about perfect plasticity. So like extremely impressionable. And we get that. But I'm just making the point right now that it's on the scientific level, it's absolutely a thing. That's how a child is able to absorb a language and learn how to walk and do all these amazing things in the first 3 years of their life. So that's, you take that just basic idea of neuroplasticity in its most raw stage, and you then put it in front of a device that's designed to manipulate our neuroplasticity. Yeah. And what the result is a lot deeper effects, a lot more likelihood for addiction, and all the things that we talked about just being that much more relevant. Then you add a couple things onto that as well, though, as far as the danger goes. The first is that, as a child, they don't have the ability to regulate things. So a lot of times I think, we almost take it for granted, and we'll talk more about this later, that, they'll be able to tell the difference between right and wrong or whatever it is. But no, when it comes to, like we talked about in early exposure to pornography, for example, children just don't have the ability to regulate, something that's highly impacting their system, whether that's sexuality or whether it's the social life anti-life on social media. They just don't have that ability. And then the last kind of like, physical disposition is the fact that, their brain is highly formable and perfectly plastic, so to speak. But it's also not completely formed. So like I said, we understand that there is a conjunction between our body and soul. And our soul, that's our intellect, it reasons. It's an immaterial thing and it does immaterial things. But at this point in our existence, it is intrinsically connected to our body, and we are one being, body and soul, which means our intellect can only act insofar as our body allows it to act. So if your intellect is the driver, your body is the car. The driver can only drive that car as well as the car is disposed to drive. If it doesn't have any wheels, it doesn't matter how good the driver is, it ain't going anywhere. And that's the foundation of like brain damage or anything like that. So with a child, you have a very undeveloped brain. And so that means that there are aspects of our reason that are just not really able to work. So a child can reason, especially at least when it gets to the age of reason, we say, which means its brain is now more or less disposed to allow that activity of the soul to work through it. But it's still going to be very small and chunky. It's going to be, childish, so to speak. It's, and especially what scientists have pinned down to, that area of our brain that's called the prefrontal cortex. So it's like it's the part of our brain that is used the most for kind of long-term decision making, prudence things, the kind of things that an adult says, if I'm going to do this, how is this going to impact me? They actually say that part of our brain isn't fully developed until we're somewhere between 20 and 25 years old, which is kind of frightening. But the point is that in a child, they just don't have that. And so, again, going back to all the different dangers that we're going to come across when it comes to technology in children, one of the point that we're making is that scientifically speaking, doesn't matter if the kid is a good kid or a bad kid, a Catholic kid or not, he has this predisposition to just not be able to reason things out well, to not have the principles, and to be extremely impressionable.
And it seems like we admit this principle to some extent, even in modern society. Like you can't vote at the age of 12, right? So I think you're just saying, great. Now there are
we just need to apply this to everything, because that's we're going to talk about the whole naivety problem. But Okay, so that's setting the stage as far as every general use of technology is going to have its more impact on a child. But the other problem then is that those things that we talked about in the first episodes, as far as like mental fatigue and just kind of being overworked mentally, all those symptoms in a child become not only symptoms but predispositions to further symptoms, because they're in a state of formation. So it's not just a child can be, mentally fatigued and not have enough energy to do its homework because it's been watching too many movies or playing video games. But it's also, it's because that brain is being formed in this sort of activity. It's causing a predisposition in that child. So there are a lot of studies that link just the whole idea of ADD and ADHD to actually just, basically the formation that the modern tech world child has to go through, as far as like being kind of chronically unable to focus on things. I'm not saying at all that it's, intrinsically connected, that it's definite, but it's definitely going to be something that plays a part in it. But same thing with learning disabilities, same thing with nervous disorders. The more our brain isn't given the chance to grow at a human pace and to, have contact with real physical human things that we normally do as we grow, and that's how we're formed. We're entering into this world of a digital universe that brings with it a lot of unreality, a lot of overpaced things, a lot of, kind of that whole idea of shallow thinking and all that. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the main kind of predisposition that I'm particularly the most worried about that I kind of dug up in reading and researching about this stuff is kind of like what we call, I guess what a psychologist would call psychological instability or emotional instability. So what that means is, for every person that has that sort of stability, we kind of take it for granted. We take it for granted. What I mean is that, we have an habitual state of mind that presumes that things are what they are and they're not what they're not. we presume that things are permanent, more or less. We believe in we just accept the validity of our own existence, the goodness of our own existence. I'm meant to be here and all that sort of thing. Like those are just kind of basic psychological principles. Like I exist and therefore it's okay that I exist because I do.
Yeah.
And this world around me exists. And yet what we're seeing more and more is that there really is in the developing youth a confusion between the real and the virtual, meaning the not real. I mean, it's actually a real thing. I mean, to be confused about whether or not my existence is valid or the things around me or what people are telling me. I mean, there's actually a whole movement online of people that, actually believe that we're living in a matrix, for example. Okay. That's kind of an extreme, but just, you kind of boil that down to what a teenager, for example, could be asking herself, after having kind of grown up in this world where they can't distinguish necessarily between what they see on the screen and what's in the real world as far as which one's real. We take it for granted. Okay, well, she must know that that's a talking snowman, and snowmen don't actually talk and things like that. But that distinction isn't necessarily made for children, and so and that can apply to all sorts of things that they see on the screen that they interact with and things like that. And that starts to give them this lack of foundation about what actually is real. So a teenager can start asking, how do I actually know what's real? How can anything I do actually make a difference? Should I actually be here? Is it actually good? Why should I actually trust someone when, there might be a whole slew of contradictions? And that's psychological instability. I'm not resting on just like the validity of existence and my own existence. And that for a child really sets them up for a lifelong battle or even failure, like the inability to just have a habitual mindset of, I need to grow. I need to keep working on my own existence and make myself better. An inability to maintain good decisions and resolutions. Like if we don't have that stability to realize, I can rest on something and then build on it. What are we going to build on?
Yeah.
It's a very real thing, and it's very troubling, and it definitely is linked to the more a child grows up in a virtual reality. And even by virtual reality, I even just mean it could just be, movies and non-immoral video games, or even just the world of, chats and pictures and videos and all these things. It's like a child can't distinguish necessarily like an adult can between that's what's on a screen and that's what's in the real world. But I mean, this again is going to extend to especially social media and especially pornography, because that's giving them, before they're able to distinguish between the two, what is the reality of social interaction? What's the reality of your value as a human being? What's the reality of human love? Yeah. You mix those ideas up, and it's already happening on the cartoon level, and that's setting for some pretty serious lack of foundation.
So to play devil's advocate, by way of clarification, someone could say, okay, Father, I'm following, but it's true also that there are fairy tales that have old fairy tales, classics that have talking animals, or maybe even, Tolkien's world is clearly a made up world. There aren't wizards and orcs and things like that. So is the difference that those are clearly not the real world that we're living in, or is it, the intensity and degree to which technology confuses what is obviously meant to not be real?
I think there's a couple big differences. Perhaps the first, most obvious one that jumps to mind is that there's a big difference between reading a story or even being told a story and being presented something visually. So for a child, that's completely different. You can sit down with a child and read them a story, and they're going to be trusting you, but they're also going to trust you in the way that you're presenting it. So an adult can very easily tell a child a fairy tale and give them the impression about what's actually true and what's not true, or even answer questions, things like that. But that distinction, just on a basic psychological level, is not being made. When it's a visual thing, it's just, this is presented as if it's truth, especially the younger a child is. So I think to me that's the biggest difference, is that there's a huge difference between how something is related through the written word or the spoken word, and from a real human being, because that's how it's coming from. It's either I'm reading this off a page that someone gave me or someone is reading it to me, and then just without any distinctions, just sucking it in from a screen, whether that's, again, it's movies or anything like that. The other thing is that when it comes to fairy tales and all that, I mean, it is something that in a sense need to be balanced. A child shouldn't just grow up on fairy tales. You know, if that's all they ever read, you do get those children that when they're 18, they're still, you know, they're still the biggest whatever Harry Potter fan or something like that. And it's like, well, I mean, are you gonna get on with life, or are you gonna keep going to those, you know, are you gonna be sleeping outside of you know, movie theaters waiting for the next Star Wars to come out or something? You know, that's an immaturity, you know, so that
like extended adolescence.
Yeah. And that can happen even just from someone who reads too much fiction. Okay. You know, that can coddle the mind for sure. So I'm not saying that your objection is completely unfounded, because it can go too far.
Yeah.
However, I think the normal way and the normal place that fairy tale and fiction have in a child's formation is that it has some place. And so it gives, you know, it kind of fills that human need for wonder and for an exploration of different ideas, for the kind of preternatural side of creation and things like that. But it has its place, and its place is subordinate to all the rest of its life, which is still in contact with reality, and then in contact with higher forms of literature and things like that.
Okay.
The problem is, go back to my original worry. The digital world is all encompassing, you know, more or less. So, you know, maybe I'm not saying that every time a child watches a cartoon, they're going to be, you know, shifted off their foundation of stability and psychological stability. Although it's always going to be something, probably, because it is that much more impacting, like I said, and there's less distinction. But the more it is something that a child is watching, like if they're watching, you know, movies every day, if they have a phone, for sure, and they're, you know, if they're living in some sort of social media world, basically the more encompassing in life it is, which again is the norm for technology and technological entertainment, then the more it's not going to be taken in any sort of good context. So it's going into a world without any distinctions of reality, and then that world becomes encompassing, and then that's why it takes the place of the real world. So yeah, the idea of fiction and all that, I think it's worth distinguishing, and it has to be balanced out like everything else. But it's still a completely different thing that we're talking about than you know, the fictional world of technology. Okay, if that answers your question.
Yeah, right? I think it's plain devil's advocate.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I mean, it just to close all that off, I guess I would say, I mean, there's one last thing that I wanted to mention as far as, okay, we have our you know, our predispositions for a child that are dangerous in itself because they're completely impressionable, all that. We have our worries of those things becoming dispositions for how they're going to grow into someone that has an inability to pay attention, you know, to focus on things, to make good decisions, to focus on their own growth, and even to just base everything on a stable notion of reality. Okay. And then the last thing though is even, this is just kind of like to sum it all up. I was reading a book recently, and I don't have any more research on this than one particular book, but it was written by a couple teachers who were writing against movements within their public school systems to put as many screens into the classroom as possible. Okay. You know? So the idea of the public school systems, a lot of them, is that let's keep up with the modern world. Kids need more iPads and things like that, because that's how they're going to learn, because that's what they're interested in. And these teachers are saying, no, the experience of teachers is the complete opposite, which of course it is. Yeah. But they went so far as to include all these studies in this to show that it's not just a mental habit that's being affected here. There's actually physical consequences. So they're trying to prove, and there is a lot of science to back it up, that when we talk about atrophy, you know, like muscle atrophy is like if you break your leg and you have to sit in a wheelchair for 8 months, the rest of your muscles on your leg are going to atrophy. They're going to shrink because they're not being used. There's actually evidence now that the brain atrophies in a measurable way. Those aspects of the brain that are used for things like our use of imagination, creativity, and problem solving. The more a child is brought up on technology
Yeah.
as an entertainment or even as a source of education. Because it doesn't have to use those parts of it. And so we're all kind of used to this idea of, oh, well, children grow up, with the movies are wrecking their imagination. But that's actually a much bigger problem than we might think. The reason a child has to live in its imagination, or at least use it a lot and be creative when they're a child, is because that's the same parts, the same habits, mental habits, that it's going to use to solve problems when it gets older. My house is falling apart. What am I going to do? Just Google something.
Yeah.
How is it that we're able to solve problems? Is because as a child we were, out there, I don't know, fighting, knights and off in the woods with our sticks and things like that. So the less that aspect of our brain is used, the more coddled again we're growing up, and that's actually something that they're beginning to measure. So it's
interesting.
It's scary. It's scary stuff. So those are all kind of like the main worries as far as what children are up against, just kind of on the basic physical neurological level. And I would just emphasize kind of what we said before, I guess, maybe three things to kind of drive the point home. So you already have that huge risk of the technological use and the overuse and all the mental symptoms being that much more impacted in children. And I think that's, in my opinion, as a priest and a teacher, and I know many would agree with me, that alone seems to suffice for why it's so much harder to teach children these days. At least children from that sort of background. But then to kind of drive home the three big points that we've been talking about too, there are really moral concerns when it comes to what our children are coming in contact with and with their inability to make distinctions and stuff. So we have, first of all, like we said before, every time you walk into the screen, so to speak, into that universe, you're coming into a culture, a godless culture. And that affects us. But now apply that to a child that doesn't have a tradition of culture in its habitual makeup already, and it's being formed. So there is a culture in movies, there is a culture in music, there's a culture in all the videos, and that culture has its own values, it has its own ideals, it has its own ends. And by and large, obviously there's always exceptions, but by and large, we're dealing with a culture that is godless, that is pornographic, that is materialistic, that's selfish, etc. I mean, that's just the world we live in, but they're drinking it.
Yeah.
Right. When you're
being formed by it.
And being formed by it. Yeah. And an adult can watch the same movie and say, well, that's clearly wrong. And they can even pull their kid aside and say, hey, that's clearly wrong. We don't think that way. And yet we might be taking it for granted that intellectual distinction that we're used to being able to make is not the same thing for a child that just absorbed something on a just a more basic impression level.
Interesting.
So this is, I think this is the world of, why our children are they're going to be affected by the fashions of the world and what's considered cool, even what's considered normal, let's say in relationships even, or when it comes to, I don't know, physical intimacy and things like that within relations. It's we as priests, as moral guides, find ourselves up against, like, when did these issues start to become something that was normally accepted by traditional Catholics? It's like, well, I mean, you're going to be affected by the culture you grow up in. That's for all of us. But if you're drinking it out of a screen, then it's going to be soaking into you. One of the teachers I was talking to recently about this, he said he's finding it more relevant that even bigger questions like, this whole gender identification, ridiculosity, sex changes, homosexuality, these things are so pushed in social media and across the different platforms and videos today that our own children are starting to when I say starting, I mean they're growing up with less clear lines than we would think possible. Yeah. Because it's just, if that's what you're soaking in. So that's the first thing, is this inundation of culture. The second thing that's much more impacting for children is, we already talked about it, social media. So it has all those negative qualities, the addiction, the social antithesis, the fact that, I already mentioned it in when we talked about social media, the fact that it really is an open door to predatory activity, the absolute presence of pornography, all those dangers, we have to just say those are much more relevant when we're dealing with children. It's a perfect exploitation of young minds, especially, as we mentioned before, young female minds. And it really just comes down to, again, there's a disproportionate ability to regulate, meaning like they don't have the ability to make the distinctions. They're not necessarily going to say, well, that's creepy. They're going to, they might just be completely exploited because they're insecurity. And this is, like we mentioned before, it is definitely and causally related to an increase in mental and emotional disorders, anxiety, depression, for girls especially, things like self-harm, bodily dysmorphia, eating disorders, suicide. Like those ideas are tossed around in whole worlds and universes contained within social media. So, you give a 13-year-old girl a phone and she can get into social media, and she has a disagreement with her parents. It might start as innocent as that, but she, by that little, her depressed 13-year-old mind, can enter into a world of, well, this is what I do and I'm depressed. And then all of a sudden she's linked to thousands and thousands of teenagers across the world that are practicing these things that we would never think possible,
Yeah.
And yet, why should she be able to tell the difference? Because especially since most of the time a 13-year-old girl, the only distinction she's able to make is like between sympathy and I'm in trouble, So you find sympathy, you're toast, Okay. So that's social media. I mean, I'm just kind of going through the list of saying like these things are that much more dangerous. And then of course, lastly, as far as the most dangerous is, we already talked a lot about impure content. So the whole pornographic world on the internet. And again, we're just making the point that children are unable to regulate. There's a disproportionate ability here. It's disproportionate to their ability, maybe I should say. And that applies even to the good kids. We're talking about something that's physically beyond them. And that's why we say that pornography on the internet, or really just any access for a child, should be against the law, because it's absolutely correlated to sexual abuse, because it has those same dispositions of like the child is going into this trusting, it's ignorant. It has to do with the manipulation of human nature. There's an informed manipulator on the other side, the pornographic industry, with the same insidious intent to in some way profit by the ignorance of this child. And it has the same effects on the children. Their self-judgment, their mental and emotional scars, their sexual irregularities. It's an awful thing, and it's so relevant, and we've already kind of hashed it all. I'm just making the point again that children aren't able by themselves to avoid this sort of thing, and that's why it's that much more dangerous for them. The conclusion, I guess, then, as far as all those things, and then we're gonna hit a couple different points, I think, is that pornography, what it does to the adolescent boy is in a sense like the evil today. It's what we're up against as far as moral concerns, and it's inescapable with tech use. Social media in some ways, not necessarily the same moral connotation, but in some ways, as far as exploiting their nature, is as impacting for a young girl as it is for a boy, because it has that same all-encompassing effect that turns gears for their entire future. And in some ways, those two things, or kind of the off branches off of them, even if it's just the world of entertainment, texting, and things like that. In some ways, like those encompass the entire world of moral formation when it comes to the apostolate of the youth these days. Like that's what we work on, and it's worth, I think, parents just really having to realize that idea. That's what it almost all comes down to. Because I mean, we could say like the vices of youth that these things tie into, human respect, selfishness, being too self-absorbed, uncharity, dishonesty, disobedience, laziness, or especially impurity, like the vices, the temptations, at least, that young people have to go up against are pit and parcel with these particular things. And also the virtues that they need to combat them: trust, obedience, openness, self-denial, honesty. Like those are the things that they need precisely against these things. So it's kind of, that's what I mean when it kind of encompasses the whole world of
if that makes sense.
So all right, well, that's That's the dark picture, I guess we could say, as far as why we should be really, really worried about children using technology.
Yeah, there's not a lot of room there for argument, but maybe making some of the application more precise. There's also then an application to the education of youth. I mean, once you acknowledge everything you've just explained, and you see the gravity and the sort of tidal wave of problems that are coming at you with social media and technology and pornography, then
it's definitely worth mentioning.
Sort of demand a unique
and that's actually kind of how this whole conversation really kind of got rolling. It's because we were trying to really kind of nail down the connection between the use of technology and our children's education. If there's something that's definitely verifiable, it's that the children who use technology most are the most difficult to teach, whether that's because they're clocked out or their attitude, whatever it might be. But yeah, there are definitely effects that we can point to. So that whole kind of conversation we had about shallowness. Our shallowness of our how we think, of our principles of learning, where we're learning from. That whole idea is the antithesis to education, especially when what we call liberal education, meaning like the true liberal arts, what we believe in as traditional Catholics, as far as what we want to give our children. We want them to be able to think philosophically, and, to express themselves well, to be able to read things and make distinctions, all that sort of thing that comes from the study of the liberal arts.
Universal tools for
universal tools. Shallow thinking is the perfect antithesis of that. It's the complete opposite. It's let's find the smallest, most restricted tools for restricted things. That's what a Google search will give you, or that's what having ChatGPT write your essay will give you. It's a complete opposite, and it might work, for whatever they want it to work for. But as far as what will it make you, completely different thing. So it really does disrupt like the use of technology in our formative years disrupts learning. It causes a sort of like this emptiness of soul. Obviously it brings about, those risks of immorality. I think one of the most relevant points, though, as far as why it's so disruptive is because it's so monopolizing. I think any of us will have had this experience, either looking back at our own childhood or our own children, as soon as a child gets out of a movie, having watched a movie, it's like, well, I'm bored now. It's because that whatever that was so monopolizing to its interests and its energies that all of a sudden it doesn't have that basic child's ability to say, now I shall make fun out of something. But that applies not just to a child entertaining itself. It's going into everything, all the different values and interests of the youth. The technological world monopolizes that. It's a what's cool, what's interesting, what's worthwhile, what's worth pursuing. Who's our sphere of influence? Again, we kind of talked about that, the whole influencing aspect, as far as like, it monopolizes that as well. Like what children are naturally going to worship heroes, so to speak. But the heroes of today are virtual heroes. They're this superhero or almost worse, I might say, this, internet influencer. Like, why are our children listening to these tape people? I don't like these people that are so obsessed with money, materialism, vanity. Like, it should be obvious that these people should not be our children's heroes, and yet they're listening to them. It's a monopolizing sphere of value and interest and influence, and that's coming up against what the educators are trying to give, as far as these are the things that you kids should be interested in. We're trying to present to you the true, the good, and the beautiful. And what the world says, and the world is a lot better at doing it to these children, and saying, well, that's not as interesting. This is way cooler. And so then you get the kid in the desk that says, I don't care.
So maybe to rephrase, if I'm following you right, I mean, part of the problem is the selection of who you want the heroes to be. But then even if you put out, hey, this is a hero, this is someone to emulate or learn from or follow, the medium, the overwhelming nature of the superhero in the movie theater and the IMAX is not going to, I mean, you're not competing on equal footing.
There's just no competition. It's like, I could be having way more fun playing games or scrolling through videos or getting an emotional rise because of this upbeat whatever thing, or I could be sitting in a desk doing homework. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And we all, I mean, I think anyone would say, well, okay, that's just the nature of education. It is, but now we're competing against someone that's way better at sparking interest in a sense. So children are not depraved.
Getting attention at least.
Yeah, getting attention. Yeah. Children are not depraved, right? So they still have a natural desire for good.
And wonder even though
wonder, but the problem is that they're much weaker and they don't have the ability to distinguish and all that sort of thing. So they're latching on to an easier good because that's the nature of children. It's very depressing sometimes, but we must not give up.
So what can we do?
Okay.
Let's.
Okay. What can we do? Well, I think the first thing that we can do is that we're going to take a step back and realize that we're not just talking about those kids.
Yeah. We're not observing something extrinsic.
Right. And both of us, I think, have mentioned this a couple times, but this is something that we have to look at is that it's what about our kids?
Yeah.
Our own traditional Catholic, or I mean, it doesn't even have to. Whoever's listening to this can very validly ask themselves, "What about my children? Is this just someone else's problem?" And the very simple answer is okay. If we were to get very philosophical, we'd say, whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver.
Yeah.
All that means is that children are the same. They're the same everywhere. Your children are the same as that person's children, as that person's children, as some family in China's children. We all have the same human nature, which means we have the same kind of brain, and which means the same effects are going to be there regardless of family, faith, and upbringing. Our children will be equally subject to all the same negative effects of tech use in general, even if that seems unlikely. Because we would definitely like to say, and I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be able to say this, it's like my kid wouldn't do that. I've sacrificed, I've been teaching them, their faith and everything. So my child wouldn't do that. It'd be nice if we can say that, but that is the error. Really, in my opinion, that's the error that our children are up against. To presume that our children can regulate or prudently use devices based on morality. When they're actually incapable of it, or that they would actually tell us about it or something like that. And this is what protectyoungeyes.com, they have a series of articles and stuff that they call NMK syndrome, which means not my kid.
Okay.
It's like, and that's their big warning to families. It's don't fall into the trap of thinking not my kid, because that's overestimating what a child is capable of.
Yeah.
And that to me is the error. So for our children, I mean, that concretely that extends, but it's not limited to that. Means our children can be addicted to technology. Our children can certainly become addicted to social media or pornography. They can certainly have the same effects of social media, even when it comes to just obsessing about their bodies. Our children can fall prey to being bullies or being bullied, eating disorders, and all the other things that, all the different mental and emotional disorders that come from the world of that sort of addiction. Our children are easily susceptible to the losing or the lowering of their standards of morality, of decency, when it comes to what they share with each other, what they look at, what they watch, what they talk about. Mm-hmm. Our children are just as easily susceptible to, the whole digital platform, the whole peer-based pressure, just as easy as any other child out there. I mean, it's all just rooted in the principle of, the adolescent's inability to prudently respond to disproportionate demands that come from the screen. Their brains aren't capable of it, even if they want it, which, thank God, many of our children do. They really do want to do the right thing. They do want to be saints. But even if they want it, it's as if their brains are not capable of it, even if they have the faith in the sacraments to support them. And I'm not saying that there's anything intrinsically lacking in grace, obviously, but go back to that whole idea of grace building off nature and why, et cetera. I mean, it's just, so those are the basic things that I think that's the danger to watch out for as far as a principle for parents to have. And I know I'm kind of getting harsh on parents because
No, I think there's a general truth that we all have blind spots, right? And the frustrating thing about a blind spot is you don't know what your particular blind spot is. But I think, and I speak as a parent myself, even in, helping and prepping for these conversations, part of it is the ever-changing world. And so, you start talking about filters and, the availability of access that is in your control and outside of your control, and you start to realize that there are a lot more things to worry about than you might have thought. And I think part of it, at least for parents, and I hope this series helps, is some kind of, I think it's helpful for parents and priests to sort of openly discuss these things to realize, hey, well, this is something I noticed or was helpful for my children, or somewhere where we kind of missed something and learned from it. So
and I guess we're trying to just expose the problem so that those conversations can happen. Because I remember earlier on when I started looking into all this stuff, talking to some parents about, their thoughts, and they were saying, but this stuff's important, but we're kind of tired of just getting beaten down.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need another priest to tell me I'm being a bad parent kind of thing, which is definitely not the point at all. I mean, I would say this, in my opinion, as long as a parent is trying to fix their mistakes or realize, is there something better I can do? I mean, that's good parenting. There's no such thing as having failed as a parent unless you die in a state of mortal sin.
Yeah.
You do that, you failed. Period.
Yeah.
That's it. And that's the only one, really. Yeah. Everything else is you figure it out, and even if it's, oh my gosh, that was a mistake, I need to fix that, that's good parenting. That's how we do as human beings. But I would say, okay, that's what that's my opinion as far as being a failure of a parent. I would say that someone could be a bad parent if they realize, wow, there's a lot more I don't know about, and this stuff could be dangerous, but I don't want to have to cause a scene. I don't want my kid to be angry. That's bad parenting. Yeah, don't do that.
Yep.
If there's a problem, and this is a problem, we have to face it, even if it's difficult. But the point is not to be, bashing parents down. We're just trying to expose the problems. Because I guess I start with that disclaimer because there's a few more things that I think are worth pointing out.
Right.
Just before we are finally at that point where we can talk about, okay, what concretely can we do? Because once we've really diagnosed the problem, that's when we can talk about solutions. So the last diagnosis that I want to put up is just, I guess, if we were to really put our face into what we're talking about. So I mentioned the error is to presume our children are more capable than they are. But if I were to point out, I think there are additional things that our children in particular are kind of up against. And by our children, I mean like in the, I guess, the conservative, especially the traditional Catholic world. Yeah. I think that in a sense, our children are spared a lot of things. Let's say, they're not necessarily exposed to all the problems and the lack of principles and everything in a public school setting, by and large. But it comes with its risks, and those risks are worth pointing out. So one of the things I think is that we're going to talk about when we talk about what can we concretely do is the example of parents that they give their children. So I would presume that most adult Catholics are doing their best to use technology virtuously, right? But for a child that doesn't have that ability to distinguish between what mom or dad are doing on their device, if they see their parent very often on a technological device, the example that they're taking is that, well, then it's good for me to do. Yeah. And we might say, okay, well, whatever, I'm using mine virtuously, but then it kind of goes back to that. If the child takes the example of it's normal and it's good for me to use things as much as mom or dad does, but then you add that added level of, but he's not an adult yet. And so he's going to have to come across a lot more dangers than mom or dad did because they just started using a smartphone, in the mid 2000s. Yeah. Well, that's a problem. It's an example thing from their earliest years. Even if parents are virtuously using their phones more or less, if the child sees them using it all the time, what they're really doing is just they're giving the example of use, and that's already an issue. A more relative issue, I think, is that when it comes to a child's formation as regards the virtue required to regulate technology, because that's what's eventually going to be needed, right? is virtue. There's definitely an issue of inactivity, and I think a lot of this comes down to we just didn't see it coming. We weren't raised with, this is how I raised my children to be prudent on the technological level. And yet there's other things I think that are impacted. So what I'm about to say, it's just kind of like if the boot fits kind of thing. It's definitely issues that we see that parents aren't often as concerned about their child's technological use as we think they should be.
Okay.
And they're not actively participating or working to give their children, the right principles or the right kind of levels of self-discipline. And especially it seems like, this is, I guess, a whole different topic, but this definitely applies to especially fatherhood in a sense. Because it by and large, it's the role of the father. And we know from all the other, conversations and things, especially within traditional Catholicism, we know fatherhood's being attacked. We get that. But one of the aspects in which fatherhood is being attacked is because the whole world of technology gives to a weak father the ability to just turn into himself instead of empty himself for the sake of his family, which is the whole point of his existence. But that turning into himself will give enough of a semblance of satisfaction or something where he might just get stuck there. And then what that means for his family is that he's no longer acting as a father for his family. He should be very, very involved and interested in what his children are doing, who they're forming relationships with, their virtues. And yet he gets home from work and chances are he's scrolling, he's playing games, he's watching movies. And that's kind of death to a family. It really can't happen. But another thing I think that is tied to that is that this is a difficult conversation in a sense, but I think there's a very real problem in a lot of traditional families where the dad, especially, not necessarily, but especially the dad is not doing his part as far as just giving his children the good principles and the realistic principles as far as sexuality and growth and things like that. Because we have to say, if a child gets a hold of a device, being exposed to something sexually explicit is almost inevitable these days, as long as they can have it for a certain amount of time. Basically inevitable. So we don't want to despair because we say, well, what we're going to say is like the most important thing is not that a child, sees something or doesn't, because it's almost inevitable, even if you just bring them into Walmart. Yeah. The important thing is that they can come to you and be helped. But if a child's never, given that foundation of trust, and especially trust as regards these sensitive topics, what's going to be in them to go to mom or dad and say, hey, I saw this, what should I do about this? And I'm not saying just that, well, dads need to get their act together and give their sons the talk. Yeah. That's kind of part of it. But the talk is a far too limited way of thinking about it. It's moms and dads, but especially dads with their sons need to get their act together and realize that I need to be giving my son a lifelong formation. I need to be preempting the struggles that he's going to have to face, and I need to be giving him every step of the way the chance and the habit of realizing that he can come talk to his dad about this the moment he's got a problem. Yep. Because it's going to happen. But that very largely doesn't happen. It's we know it's difficult. It's awkward. Yep. I think one of the main reasons is that dads feel ashamed, as if they're kind of exposing their moral faults or something like that, which just isn't the case at all. Yeah. It's a completely different thing to confess your sins to your son as it is to to be able to admit to him, I struggled with this too, because every man does, and we have to, that's why I'm here to help. Like, it's a completely different scenario. Yeah. So shame's a big thing, and that just kind of hesitation. And I think part of that hesitation comes down to that question, like, well, I don't know what I'm going to say. How am I going to do it well? I'm afraid of botching it all up. Look, the end goal is trust. Yeah. It's not information. The kid's going to get information pretty easily. But the end goal is that you can talk to me about this, and it's not a terrible thing, and I'm going to give you good principles about God's sacred creation. And chances are the first conversations are just going to go right over the kid's head, but he's going to know I can come back. So don't worry about saying it all perfectly. Don't worry about giving all the correct information. Just worry about doing it already and doing it often. And don't let the kid bat you away, whether that's your son saying, "Nah, Dad, I'm fine." It's like, "Oh, I guess he's fine," or the daughter that says, "No, what? There's nothing. I'm not upset about anything." Well, honey, she said she's not upset about anything. So what do you want me to? No, I mean, you gotta, dig in a bit, Dad. So that's, I think, something that for some reason it seems like affects our circle of dads even more in a sense than outside circles. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think a part of it is just, a part of it could just come down to, immature marriages in a sense. What I mean by that is, you might say, okay, why would Catholic marriages be more immature than non-Catholic ones or something like that? What I mean by that is that, for Catholics to get married, to raise a family is just kind of like part of it. It's things like contraception are just, they're not even on the table. For a family in the world to get married and have children, it's a much more concrete choice. It's either we're going to have children or we're not. Whereas it seems to me that it's almost more possible for young people in a conservative traditional atmosphere to get married and not really make that commitment to we're going to have children, because it's kind of something taken for granted. And so they can enter into a marriage very immaturely and just be like, well, we're here. Yeah, we get to be married now. This is great. And then all of a sudden there's all these children and we never actually had to make that choice. I'm going to be a father and I need to figure out how I'm going to do that. So that's a theory, I guess. That's an opinion, is why it seems like in some senses, our fathers are being even more attacked by the lack of fatherhood in the world, because it's almost in a sense they're making less of a concrete choice. I don't know. But that whole lack of education as far as the sexual world goes, that leads to more shame for the child. That leads to obsessive curiosity if they're not given enough principles and ideas as they grow along to satisfy their kind of natural curiosity. If you form a morbid curiosity in a child because you restrict them from any sort of exposure to any sort of sexual idea whatsoever, well then, they're still human. They're still going to grow up wondering. And then if you make them, in a sense, have to figure it out on their own, where are they going to find it? Well, these days they're going to find it on a Google search. So that whole... Or
their friends who have found it on a Google search.
Or their friends who have Google searches, or their friends that are watching pornography. It's true, that you've kind of lost. At least you've lost a battle in that sense. If you kind of let them get into that state where now it's too late, they're too old, they've developed too much, they've been exposed to...
they've trusted someone else.
Then it's, oh, man. There's never... you've definitively lost again.
Sure.
But as long as everybody's still breathing, but you've lost that battle. So that one's worth... Parents, we got to talk about this. Yeah,
so you would say, to be clear, you would even emphasize being overly sure that you're discussing this rather than worrying about, So
at least
to be clear.
Sorry. I think at least as far as trust goes and checking in with children and answering questions, it is better to be a year too early than a day too late, or to be more sure that that they're at least aware of dangers that they can come across, than hesitating until they're just quite old enough. Because if a child's too young, chances are they're just going to be like, okay, well, if that ever is a thing, I guess I'll talk to you about it, sure. But if they're too old, chances are they're saying, oh, thanks. Would have been nice to know that. So it is. And I'm not saying we have to go all out and make sure that children are experts on every biological fact. That's definitely, the facts are not the important thing. It's the trust, it's the color that we give them. It's the idea of, if the first contact that a child's mind has with sexuality is from a parent, a trusted parent, who's even stumbling but serious and cares and has a principle in his own mind of this is a sacred reality, then that's the color that idea is going to have in that child, versus if it's a pornographic one, if that's their first contact. So a lot of it, again, is going to come back to, and we're going to talk about this next too, is just how parents think about these things themselves and how they work in their own lives for, respect and chastity and things like that. Because if you don't have that principle, good luck passing it.
Sure.
At least in all the ways that we want to. So yeah, we want to talk about, because there's no easy fix, but we want to, at least when I say we, I mean parents need to talk to each other, spouses need to talk to each other about, how ought we to try and approach this proactively, because we don't want our child growing to distrust everything sexual on the one hand, or to be obsessed about learning more about things on the other hand. So I mean, there's all sorts of practical applications, but I mean, to start with the principles is the most important thing. And I know we're probably going to be putting things in the description, things like that. But I'll just say right now, there's a book that that you all carry, I think, by Father Henry Sattler, and I'm not sure where he came from or what his story is, but the book is called Parents, Children, and the Facts of Life, which isn't a very good title, but the book, as far as its approach to how you can form your children realistically over a lot amount of time and emphasizing trust, it's very, very well written. So I would definitely recommend that as a starter for conversation.
We'll make sure there's a link for everyone watching.
There we go. Lastly, then, as far as kind of what our children perhaps are more particularly up against, is we do have to put ourselves in a mindset that understands what they're thinking. Growing up, we fought the battle, right? We decided we're moving to this place, we're going to this mass, we're being taught by these priests. But our children, when they come in contact with the world, especially, the neighborhood kids or whatever it is, they are the weird ones. They for sure are. They realize that they're the odd ones out, and they do see the outside world. But even if they don't have contact with those friends, they see that outside world through the movies again, through the screens. They see that there's something different about how we do things. They feel that judgment of the world. They realize their abnormality. And if they're not kind of being proactively given, age-appropriate principles and reasons and support, an example from their families and their parents, the tools to combat these, the conclusions will be they're going to start to distrust, their authorities, whether that's the parents or their teachers or their school, and they're going to trust more in this world through the screen, just because, again, that world might be more sympathetic, it might be more flashy and attractive, and
it's easier, it's more fun.
It's more fun, that's tough for a child to make those distinctions. And I would say, that all of these things that I'm talking about, there's no easy just like do this and don't do this. It is a balance. But I would say by and large, just like when it comes to tech use in general, the less your child has to fight those battles earlier on, the better. And if that means to shelter to a degree, I will go down on paper saying that, because there are some things that are worth sheltering from, and those things are the things that that children don't have the regular ability to deal with normally. So virtue, in a sense, to a raw human nature, is less attractive than the world. So we just can't presume that their goodwill is going to win out, or their prudence. So we have to take it upon ourselves. We got to protect. So our kids are just susceptible, and they also have those kind of additional problems there. They're still open to being helped. Of course, they're still children, but I think if there's one kind of final conclusion I want to make, it's that they won't take that first step. We can't expect them, to come to us.
Don't put the burden on them.
Right. Don't put the burden on them. It's up to us to say, okay, we got to find the balance between protection, call it sheltering if you want, at least when it comes to technological use in general, just the basic dangers of exposure to culture and all the other problems. The younger they are, the less they should have, period. Just in every medium, in every context, just the younger they are, the less. And if none, all the more better, when they're in their first toddler years and things like that, they're not going to be missing out. And that's hard for parents already, because the screen brings a big help to parenting. It's like, well, I don't have to worry about whether or not my kid is falling out of a tree right now, because I know she's safely downstairs watching a movie, Winnie the Pooh or something. It's like, well, I get it, but and I'm not going to make decisions for you, but when it comes to, how much do I want to allow my child to even just start be neurologically connected to these things, The less is better. That's at least the conclusion of everything that I've been reading and studying and things like that. And then after that, so there's the first step of protection. Then there's the question of kind of gradual exposure. That's something that needs to be worked out between parents. A constant kind of proactive formation, a lot of collaboration between parents, getting on the same page, finding out what your goals are, how you're going to respond to different things. And don't be discouraged if you have to keep discovering and keep working and keep, that's the whole idea. And then lastly, kind of like the two biggies is that, and this is going to segue, I guess, into the next section, because our next and kind of final, at least plan for now, is that we're going to get into all the practical, these are our best suggestions on how to do all these things well. But it's our own use of technology, and it's our regulation within our family that's really going to make all the differences. So it's those, how you help the child grow, and to be absolutely hardline on what they have access to when they're still under your control, and then your own personal use in that example you're giving. And then lastly, like I said before, it's like the goal as far as what parents want to shoot for is that foundation of trust, of openness, of conversation, and don't give up on it. Really, really pray and want that good of your child's soul, and then keep pursuing it. And that's, however practically that turns out, that's what we want. That's that practicality and trust that is essential here. So.
All right, Father, that's great. Thank you very much. Covered a lot of ground there. And as you mentioned, the next episode, and for now we say final because I think what we'll do after these are out is we'll collect some questions and answers, and we'll do a follow-up episode, let's say, in a few months. So whenever it is you're hearing this, there either will be or is already a Q&A session. But for now, we're going to do the next episode on practical how-tos and connected to this conclusion of yours. So, all right. Thank you, Father.
Sure thing.